So we have been in this series over the last 8 weeks, all of summer. We've been looking at the Sermon on the Mount, which is Jesus' most famous teaching. There's a lot of passages and verses in this that we are familiar with, that we recognize. And I think that that's true of a lot of what the scripture says. You may not think of yourself as, maybe even not as a Christian. Maybe you don't think of yourself as someone who's memorized a lot of scriptures, but we're actually familiar with lots of verses, lots of teachings, and lots of ideas of what Jesus is calling us to do, who he's calling us to become, how he wants us to live our lives. And we're wrapping it up today. We're going to be looking at the very last thing that Jesus taught in the Sermon on the Mount. We did this over 9 weeks. Jesus, I wasn't there, but I heard it was like a 40-minute sermon, so I'm just kidding. But yeah, it was one teaching, but we wanted to break it up into different chunks because there's so much here. Even though this is 2,000 years ago that he said these words, there's so much here that still applies and challenges the way that we live today. And so today, as we wrap it up, we are going to be looking at one word really specifically. It's kind of a sticky word. It's a difficult word. It's been twisted and misused a lot. It's kind of been used, maybe even weaponized by people like me, pastors and churches and Christians and leaders. We've used this word in a lot of different ways, and a lot of times we've used this really to our own benefit. And we want to spend some time today because I want to clear up what this really has to do with. But that word that we are looking at today is obey. Obey, obedience, if you want to say a longer word. Same thing. This idea of obedience, of obeying, is really kind of a difficult thing. And a lot of times this has really been used as a kind of a power move by people that are in leadership roles, leadership responsibilities. But the word obey, the idea of obeying, is really the practical part. It's the action part of what Jesus is calling us to do. He teaches these ideas, and it's not just because it's a beautiful theory. It's not just because it's the way that he wanted things to be, but they're all broken, but I just want to at least let you know how nice it was supposed to be. He wants us to obey. He wants us to take what he teaches and live it out in our day-to-day lives, which for some of us, maybe even most of us or all of us, that feels crazy because he said some things that are really difficult. He said some things that are really hard to live out, to live up to pursue in our lives. But this is really what he wants from us, is from us to obey. We're going to look at this in just a second. This past week, it was my birthday this last week. As you guys may remember, last week there was this phenomenal dance on stage that surprised me and maybe you. But for my birthday, we went up to Big Bear. We were there for 2 nights. It was just a quick trip, and we had a great time. We stayed with some friends, and one of the friends that we were there with is just kind of this like outdoor wizard. I don't know if that's the right combination of words, but everything outdoors is his kind of gear. Whereas I'm a bit more indoorsy, as some comedians like to say. But I grew up outside. I'm comfortable outside, but I like inside too. Anyway, so he's there, and we're probably there for, a few hours into the day, and we're in Big Bear. There's like this big hill and tree. We're kind of like in the middle of nowhere in this space. And so literally we're hanging out. The kids are just kind of getting comfortable and rolling around in dirt and all the things that kids like to do. And all of a sudden he just starts pulling out activities. But they're not activities like I normally pull out, like coloring books or guitars for sing-alongs or things like that. He's pulling out throwing axes and bows and arrows, multiple bows and arrows, BB guns, pellet guns, all of these things. And of course, I'm like, oh, I'm not going to go home with all my kids, am I? And my 10-year-old could not have been more excited. His eyes just about popped out of his head. And so we're like trying to do everything. And much to my dismay, he kind of brought them all out and then just left them. And so my 10-year-old has like a BB gun in one hand, an axe in the other, and it was just a picture of America, really. But my kids, they live in Costa Mesa, and so they wear board shorts and flip-flops all the time. And so they were, of course, throwing the axes at the target, and there was adult supervision, don't worry. And then after a little while, they were like, okay, let's just cut down other stuff. We have an axe. Let's see what else this can cut. And so there was this other piece of wood on the ground, and so my son, with whom I am well pleased, takes his flip-flopped foot and puts it on this wood and just reaches back to hack at this tree stump, Don't worry. I stopped him. I said, whoa. And he like, what? I was like, bro, you have flip-flops on. Please don't cut off a toe. Don't cut yourself. Please don't. Let's make it all the way down. There's this thing where I then had to step in and be like, okay, so here's how, like you approach it this way, like I knew what I was doing. And same thing with the BB guns. And I taught him what I wanted him to do. Like he knew how to pull the trigger and all the types of things, but I needed to teach him how I wanted him to handle it. And it wasn't because I wouldn't love him if he used the axe wrong. It's because I wanted him to have all 10 toes when we came home from the mountain. I didn't need him to obey me so that I loved him or so that I cared about him or so that he was lovable, although a 9-toed, I wanted him to obey me because I cared about his safety, because I cared about my safety, because I cared about his health. I cared about the path that he was on. And I think really as we look at this word obey, I think sometimes we get this really kind of negative connotation of like, okay, I've got to obey, so that means I don't get to do something that I want to do, which means that God's this wet blanket who's trying to ruin all the fun or whatever it is. But really what God is concerned about is your life, the way you navigate your relationships, the way you show up in your community, the way you process events like the chaos from the last week and hurricanes and different things, which we're going to pray for in a little bit at the end of the service. God cares about you. He loves you. And because of his love for you, he wants you to obey so you experience wholeness and health. He doesn't want you to obey so he can love you. That's one of the ways that we have gotten this backwards, I think, oftentimes as pastors and churches. We have taught obedience as the first step in the Christian life. And I think for a lot of people, when they come into Christianity or faith or whatever it is, when it's understood or taught that I am a Christian because I obey, then all of a sudden we have this rules-based religion, and it's a really difficult journey. In the early church, you can read about this in the book of Acts, the first church in Acts chapter 2. This really kind of interesting thing happened, and it goes on throughout the book of Acts. These people that had heard Jesus' teachings, that walked with Jesus, people that sat and heard the Sermon on the Mount. After Jesus resurrected, they're all in a house and they're hanging out and they're sharing what they remember Jesus teaching and how he taught and the parables and the sermons and the different things, the experiences that they had with them. They share all of these different teachings, and then this really bizarre thing happens. They actually start to do those things that Jesus taught. They're like, okay, well, I guess let's sell all of our possessions and give what we have to everyone that's in need. I guess let's share food and make sure that everybody has enough food. I guess let's honor each other and pursue the outsider and make them the insider. I guess let's love, let's turn the other cheek, let's forgive, let's live this way. It was really absolutely upside down and bizarre because this wasn't what anybody else taught at the moment. At that time, nobody else was teaching. These are Jesus' teachings, and they started to live them out. They started to obey. They began to handle their money and their relationships, kindness towards enemies. They started to show up in a different way. And everyone that saw it and experienced it was fascinated. Jewish people and Romans, everyone that experienced this, over time, this faith, this Christianity, it caught on, and the church grew and grew so rapidly, not because there was an awesome band or a great teacher or that there was some sort of celebrity, but it spread and it caught on and people were moved by it because these people were doing these things that Jesus taught, and it changed the world. And I think for a lot of us, we struggle with this idea of obeying, of obedience, of living out what Jesus has taught us. I think that it's important for us to recognize maybe the pattern, that we listen, we hear what Jesus' words are. We hear the teachings of Jesus, and then as we hear, as we become familiar, we start to believe. We believe that he is who he said he is. We believe that his teachings are the path to life. We believe that life and wholeness alone are found through him, and then as we believe, it allows us to obey, because it's really scary to try and obey some of these things if we don't believe that it's true. These are really big asks that he makes of us in the Sermon on the Mount. And if we don't believe that he is who he says he is, then why would we ever actually do those things. Jesus doesn't want us to obey to prove our love. Obeying God does not lead to love. Loving God results in obedience. My son is just as lovable, regardless of the injuries from the throwing axe that he didn't get. It wouldn't have changed the love. But there is this peace, and I think every parent, and maybe even every dog owner, understands, like, when you listen to me, when you obey me, there is this sense of wholeness, of depth of relationship, of connectivity. There's a sense of love that continues to grow and expand. So we're going to look at one of Jesus's parables at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. This is the last thing that he taught in the Sermon on the Mount to a group of people who had been listening. They had been following. Many of them were already following him. They believed that he was who he said he was. And I think that he told us this parable because I think he wants us to understand that when God asks us to obey, it's not because God wants to remove fun or remove happiness or make you miserable. It's a sense of God understanding the wisdom that God has on here is how you can experience life and wholeness and make it through a world that is oftentimes filled with pain and chaos. Does anybody feel like the world is ever full of pain or chaos? Show of hands. Nobody? Wow. I want your guys' lives. I think that there's an invitation for us here to understand that this parable is teaching us that obedience makes practical difference in our lives. Listening is great. Belief is crucial. Because through belief, we find faith and we're connected to God through Jesus. But the practical difference happens oftentimes when we obey the teachings of Jesus. To put it another way, faith in Jesus is when we believe, and following Jesus is when we obey. And I think one of the terms that's really been popular, especially over the last, I feel like maybe 10 or 15 years, is this idea of like, are you a Jesus follower? And I think so many of us, myself included, would say, yeah, I'm a Jesus follower. But then the next question is, well, am I obeying? Am I actually doing the things that he's told me to do? So we're going to be in Matthew chapter 7. If you guys have your Bibles, you can open there, start in verse 24. For those of you guys watching online, I forgot to say hi. Hi. I saw my mom's watching online today. Hi, Mom. So we'll have verses on the screen for you guys as well. I saw Alina's in there hosting. Thank you guys for joining us online. Matthew chapter 7, verse 24. I'm going to read the very first word. Therefore... Let's pause. We'll move faster than this the rest of the sermon, I promise. When I was in Bible college, my professor said, anytime in the Bible you see a therefore, you have to ask, what's it there for? You're welcome. I just gave you $120,000. No, so he says, therefore. And what does he mean by that? Again, he has just taught all through the Sermon on the Mount, all of these teachings of the ways that we're supposed to show up in our lives. I have a little bullet point of list, these teachings about how hating someone is like murder, how lust is like adultery, these teachings on turning the other cheek, on if someone demands something of us that we should do even more than they ask, the teachings about how we should handle our money and the generosity with which we should approach the world. The teachings on forgiveness and forgiving people no matter what, even the times when it feels like it's letting them off the hook. The teachings on pursuing people who have wronged you, on treating others the way you want to be treated, on taking the plank out of your own eye before you judge someone else. All of these things that Jesus has taught. And at the very end, he says, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine, if these things that I've just said, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. There's 4 verses. We're going to look at each one as we go through. Everyone who hears the things that I've just taught and puts them into practice is like a wise man who puts them on the rock. Now, just like I'm not totally outdoorsy, I also am not a general contractor. But even I know that you want to have a solid foundation when you're building a house. And everybody in this day would have known that as well because they didn't even have all the technology that we have. They would know it's super crucial to have a solid foundation. And so Jesus is teaching this idea, and everyone who hears these words is like a wise person who builds their house on a rock. And the people that would have heard this would have been like, well, yeah, obviously. It's obvious you want to build your house on a rock. That's common sense. That's like base level of what you should do. And I think Jesus was probably like, yeah, It is. You should put these teachings into practice. That's base level. This is basic. This is the base kind of foundation of what you should be doing here. You should hear what I'm saying, and you should start to do these things. There's almost, I don't know if people would have heard it this way in that time or not, but there's almost an arrogance that's coming from what he's saying. Of course, Jesus isn't arrogant. He's right. But he's saying everyone who rearranges their life, reorganizes their lives around these teachings is building on a solid foundation. There's something trustworthy and true that you're able to live on when you focus on these teachings. Like I said earlier, Jesus didn't intend this just to be like a great ethical theory. He really expected us to follow his teachings. It's almost as if Jesus is like locking eyes with you across like a coffee table and is saying, please do these things. This will help you. Your life will be more stable. Your home, your family, your relationships, whatever career aspirations, whatever it is you're navigating, when storms and chaos and pain and surprises and tragedy, when the storms come, you will be more stable. Please do these things. Like a father, like your heavenly Father who's looking at you, his child that he loves, saying, please do these things. Please don't cut off your toe with the axe. Please, I'm trying to help you. I'm trying to give you a pathway to walk on. The verse 25 comes, and for those of us that grew up in Sunday school, we know that there's a song that goes along with this verse. It says, the rain came down and the floods came. Thank you. Who was it? Show of hands. Who knew the words? Thank you. Yes, church kids. For everybody else, let me teach you so you can be tormented for the rest of your life. It says, the rains came down and the floods went up. That's the wrong melody, but it's close enough. So anyways, verse 25. Sorry, I just needed to make sure I had everybody singing that in their head for the rest of the day. Verse 25, Jesus is teaching. He says, the rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. Again, the rock is doing what Jesus taught. This house was built on this foundation of obeying Jesus' teachings and Jesus' commands. And so when the storm comes, maybe it lost a few tiles, maybe there's a few shingles that flew off, but the house was still standing. It's important, I think, for us to recognize that Jesus says, if you do what I say, then you won't have any storms in life or any difficulties or any problems. He's not promising like a get out of chaos free card. In another part in John 16, Jesus says, you will have many troubles in life, which is no one's favorite memory verse. But then the next part, there's a guarantee, like you will have troubles, but fear not or take heart because I have overcome the world. There's this reality that we all know, we've experienced that there is chaos, there are storms, there are difficulties and challenges, like whatever's happening over there. That storm, they might have blown that building over. I don't even know. I'm just kidding. No, they are always having the best time, and I love it. And just so you guys know, I never care when I hear kids having a good time. I know sometimes people are like, oh, I wonder if he's nervous that he can't. It's like, no way. I love it. So I'll let you guys all off the hook on that one. Jesus, he's not saying if you listen to me, everything in your life will be perfect or go perfectly. He's saying if you obey my teachings, then you will be able to weather the storms that are guaranteed to come. You will make it through on the other side. Life is hard on every aspect of us. The world is broken. People are broken. We experience that in our relationships, in our marriage and careers and health, physical health. There's all of these different aspects, these storms that come. And Jesus is calling us to build on a foundation of his teachings, of obeying his teachings. At the end of the day, at the end of the storm, we'll be standing, not because we went to church, not because we had good thoughts or good intentions, but because of a life where we practiced putting into our lives what Jesus taught. We're really going for it. Still not bothered. I'll let you know if I get bothered. Just kidding. I should install like a little buzzer button under this thing and be like, a little red light flashes. Lock it up, kids. Just kidding. This parable goes on. Jesus says, anyone who hears these words and puts them into practice is this key piece. And then he says in verse 26, everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. Again, just really cutting, like Jesus not mincing a lot of words. Like, if you don't listen, you're a fool. If you don't listen, you don't do even the most basic thing that everybody knows you shouldn't do. You shouldn't build your house on a sand. If you don't listen, apply, obey, put into practice what I'm teaching you, then you are just like a foolish person who builds their house on the sand. Jesus wants us to understand that from his perspective, Jesus is the one who all things were created through him and by him, who created life, who created marriage, who created community, goodness, beauty, all of these things. Jesus, who created those things, from his perspective, to ignore his teachings is the equivalent of building your house downriver on the sand. This extraordinary thing, he's calling these people to live out in these upside down, crazy ways. And that's why obedience, I think, follows belief. Because he calls us to live in ways that don't make any sense. Like, I worked for this. This is my money. This is my stuff. I should be able to do whatever I want for it. And Jesus teaches it a different way. This person hurt me or attacked me or wounded me. I should be able to react and respond in kind. And Jesus teaches us a different way. All of these aspects, Jesus is teaching us these totally countercultural ways. And realistically, the only way that anyone would do those things is if they actually believed who he was. Saying, I want you to believe. And because you believe, I want you to have the confidence to obey. Verse 27, a storm comes for the second house. It says, the rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against the house, and it fell with a great crash. I think there's two things I want to point out. First, when I was growing up in Sunday school, when they taught me that song, I was always made to believe if you are a Christian, then your house will stand, and if you are not a Christian, then your house will get crushed by the storms. And as I've read this as an adult, what I've come to realize is that Jesus is not talking to Christians and non-Christians. He's talking to people, maybe all Christians. He's saying, you can listen and you can believe, but are you going to obey? Are you going to hear what I've taught you and put it into practice? This is a conversation for church people. This isn't a conversation for people to get them to believe in Jesus. This is a conversation for us to say, okay, I believe, but am I actually following? Am I obeying? Am I putting these teachings into practice? So this is for us. And the second thing is it's the same exact storm. It's the same exact chaos. The rain came down, the streams rose, the winds blew, beat against the house. The same thing happened to both houses, and one of them makes it through because of the foundation it's built on, which is putting into practice what Jesus taught. Jesus is saying, living out my teachings is living with common sense. It would be foolish to do it another way. I think there's three things that kind of come from this parable. As Jesus wraps up this whole sermon, he says, okay, therefore, based on all of these things, anyone who hears these things and puts them into practice is wise. Built their house on a solid foundation. And anyone who doesn't is a fool. And I think there's three different ways that we can kind of hear this parable. And in the last couple minutes that I have, I just want to point these out. The first way is I think that this parable can be a comfort. This idea of the house built on the rock and the house built on the sand, I think it can maybe be comforting or affirming. What I mean by that is some of you, like I have, you have had really difficult experiences in life. Maybe some significant trauma or tragedy. Maybe there's been medical diagnoses, health things you've wrestled through, marital things, all kinds of different stuff. And for some of you, you look back on that and you can honestly say, I would not have made it if it wasn't for God, if it wasn't for this rock, this foundation that I've been able to stand on. For some of us, this is a comfort because it reaffirms what you have believed to be true and what you've lived out in your life. You've experienced making it through a storm, and you can look back and say, that could only be because of God. There's no way I could have done that on my own. I've had that experience. I bet a lot of us have had those experiences. It can be a comfort. The second way that this parable can be heard is as a warning. As a warning. I think that maybe for some of us, the reality is that we know better than the way that we live. We know how we should be interacting or showing up or connecting with our spouse or caring for our kids or being honest in our business dealings or handling our stuff. I think for some of us, there may be a warning here. Maybe we enjoy church, which is great. I want people to enjoy church as much as they are. Maybe we read our Bibles. Maybe we have memory verses or scriptures, and there's spiritual things in our heads and around us, and we believe the right things. But I wonder if there's maybe some of us that this is a warning of saying, hey, yes, you believe, and yes, you have this saving faith, but are you obeying, and do you have a foundation that's able to sustain you in the midst of a storm? Sometimes I think maybe the challenge is that everything feels like it's fine. Like it doesn't look like there's any storm clouds in the sky. And so I can just keep doing things the way that I've been doing. It's working out so far. I think Jesus is teaching this because it's not about the storm that you're in right now. It's about this lifelong journey ahead of you that you build this foundation on. The realities of life, what's coming in the next 12 months or 12 years. The worst time, I read this this past week, it said the worst time in the world to be rethinking your foundation is when there's a flood. It's like when everything's falling apart, it's the worst time to be like, you know what? We should have a new foundation. It's like at that point, you're just like picking up your stuff and leaving. When we were up this week, like I said, my kids are very much beach kids, and so if it's flip-flops or nothing. So most of the time they were actually barefoot, and they, just to clarify, they did come home with all of their fingers and toes. Nobody shot anybody's eye out or anything like that, but they just kept running outside with no shoes on, no flip-flops, and I was like, I don't really care like on the dirt side of things, but I was like, Bud, like, I think you're going to hurt your foot, talking to Arlo. I was like, you really should wear flip-flops. There's like gravel and pine cones and all kinds of stuff. I mean, it was a huge area. And he's like, okay. But obviously didn't wear flip-flops. And then it didn't take very long for him to come inside hopping, crying, sobbing because something had hurt his foot. So I pick him up because I'm very loving and gentle. And I put him on the counter. I'm like, are you okay? He's like, I've got something in my foot. And I look at it and it's like an 1.5 inch thorn. I was like, oh my gosh. I'm like, okay, like, you know, and I go and I try to pull it out. He swats my hand and finally I get it out and I'm like, this is why I told you to wear flip-flops. We've all had these moments. It doesn't have to be as a parent, as a friend. It can be all kinds of different scenarios, but it's like, you know, I told you that this was going to happen, right? And it's the least helpful thing in the world. I think maybe for some of us, like maybe for my 6-year-old, like the warning of like, please wear flip-flops, please wear shoes. You're going to step on something's going to get hurt. And we don't always listen to the warnings, but I think there's an invitation, and maybe today is an invitation for you to reassess the foundation that you've been building, reassess the belief that you have and the way that you're obeying. And then the third thing that this parable can maybe bring us is an explanation of what you're going through, maybe even right now, an explanation of why it feels like you've been going to church for a few years or maybe a few decades and nothing in your life is any different. Maybe it's an explanation of why you feel like as you've put intentionality into certain aspects of your life, finances or marriage or health or whatever it is, there's still storms that come and you feel like everything's getting blown over. I think maybe there's an explanation because belief is crucial, and it's by believing in Jesus, in his name, that we're saved. And it's by obeying this practical action of living out what he taught that we experience a different life, that we see change and transformation happen in our relationships, happen in the areas of the habits and the addictions that we have. This change and transformation happens in the different aspects of when the storms are coming and we're able to make it through the other side because we have been putting into practice what Jesus has taught us to do. Jesus, I think, wants us to hold on to this reality that obeying his teaching is what oftentimes makes the biggest difference in the day-to-day realities of our lives, but it always makes the biggest difference in the storms that we face. And I think that it comes down to this question of trust. Do we trust our own ability to anticipate the future, or do we trust God's ability to anticipate the future? Solomon wrote it this way in Proverbs 3. He said, "Trust in the Lord with all of your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all of your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight." With all of your heart, and don't lean on your own understanding. There's an invitation for us to trust the teachings of Jesus, to obey the teachings of Jesus, as difficult as they may seem, as upside down as they may seem, countercultural, whatever the word is that feels like it fits the best. Yes, I believe, and do I obey? And this is the question that I want us to wrestle with. Do I believe, and will I obey? Let's pray together.